Hey everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to why did the English Civil War happen by Kings and Generals. Now, bearing in mind, this technically isn't the first Civil War that England has had. The first, technically, was the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses was technically the first Civil War, even though that was between the houses of Lancashire and York. Lancaster and York, sorry. And, even though I would say that's technically the first Civil War, but this is known as, but this is always by historians the main Civil War in England alone. So, and I've owned parts of this that I know are like towards the end, like with, you know, obviously with the monarchy being overthrown, and then when England became a republic, things were getting so bad that they, long story short, invited the royal family back into power. But to this day, it ended up being a constitutional monarchy. But that being said, the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical: if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, it is probably obvious that I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. So with that being said, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals, another great history channel here on YouTube. And without rambling on too much longer, let's get this up on screen and let's get into this.
Parliamentary democracy is one of the most dominant governmental systems in our world today, present in countries from Germany to Israel and India to Australia. Its origins, however, lie in the deadliest conflict in Britain's long and rich history. Lasting almost a decade after its beginning in 1642, the English Civil War claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, unseated a royal house, and resulted in the development of a constitutional monarchy which remains to this very day. Before we cover the battle,
which was probably for the best,
of the period, however, we'll be outlining the many reasons behind the outbreak of one of the most politically impactful conflicts of all time. It's not all about division though. This video is sponsored by a game that's all about finding true companionship and changing the world. Champion token, 100,000 gold and 100 diamonds right away.
Feel free to check them out if you're interested.
The Stuart dynasty came to power in England when the childless Elizabeth I died on March 24th, 1603, and was succeeded by King,
which was known as the Virgin Queen, for those who don't know,
of Scotland, James VI, who then also became James I of England. This reign united the realms of England, Scotland and Ireland under one monarch for the first time, and saw an increase in the popularity of divine right, the God-given authority.
So basically, there's your creator of the United Kingdom. Obviously, it's a lot different than what it was then, for obvious reasons, but still.
Authority of a monarch to rule as he wished, unhindered by his nobles or people. After 22 years on the throne, during which momentous events such as the sailing of the Mayflower and Guy Fawkes' gunpowder plot took place, King James died in March 1625 and was succeeded by his second son, who ascended to the throne as Charles I. A scholarly-oriented man with a penchant for hunting, it immediately became clear that Charles had inherited his father's enthusiasm for divine right, and began acting in ways which profoundly angered influential factions in his country, the most important of which being Parliament. Today, the British Houses of Lords and Commons are the governing institutions of the United Kingdom, but in the mid-17th century this was not yet the case. The king still had executive decision-making authority, and his decree was the only means by which Parliament could legally convene. However, by the mid-1600s, the Houses had gained significant de facto power, such as the ability to raise taxes far more effectively and smoothly than the king himself, making it hard for English monarchs to operate without parliamentary approval. Upon ascending to the throne in 1625, the outwardly Protestant Charles married Henrietta Maria, the staunchly Catholic sister of France's King Louis XIII. While this was at first viewed as a shrewd diplomatic move, Maria's fervently pro-Catholic actions made the predominantly reformed English despise her. This religious dimension of the royal parliamentary divide was made worse by a number of factors, both internal and external. In mainland Europe, the 30 Years' War was raging without end. Many in England, and particularly in Parliament, wished to take up arms in order to prevent the Catholic Counter-Reformation from snuffing out their Protestant brothers, but Charles would not do so in a direct fashion. The meagre attempts in 1625 and 1628 of Charles to intervene at Cadiz and the Siege of La Rochelle respectively were blundered and only increased tension between the king and his parliament. Even worse than this was the increasing influence of William Laud, the intrusive Bishop of London, who advocated an anti-Calvinist sect of Protestantism known as Arminianism. This denomination rolled some Christian practices back closer to those of the Roman Catholic Church, and was viewed as yet another sign that Charles I was dangerously friendly to the hated Papists. All of these facts.
If anyone's learned about Henry VIII, for all his flaws, because he was known for the wife killings mostly, and one of the things that he done could be debatably good for England was taking the English Church, taking the power of the English Church away from the Pope, and then make the Church of England self-governing. Which, as I said, whether it's a good thing is always going to be debatable, but still, but I just won't go too much detail.
Ratcheted up the tension between Parliament and the monarchy. In short, it was making England a powder keg. More tangible issues were also at the heart of the Gulf, the most prominent of which was a growing opposition of the propertied classes in Parliament to the absolute rule of their monarch. The first Parliament called by the King in 1625 got off to a bad start on this front because of that most enduring of issues, taxes. Usually, Parliament would grant a new monarch permission to levy customs duties, called tonnage and poundage, for an entire reign, but for Charles they only gave such permission for 1 year. Parliament did grant levels of funding and taxation that would have been adequate in the past, but that was woefully inadequate when taking into account inflation and other costs. With Parliament continuously unwilling to grant sufficient funding, Charles began to raise money by his own means. Money was borrowed, with the crown jewels as security for repayment. Tonnage and poundage customs were collected regardless of parliamentary approval, and, most annoying to those affected, so-called forced loans were imposed on Charles's wealthier subjects. Overall, Charles raised over £250,000, but these measures caused anger and resentment. Many gentlemen refused to pay and were imprisoned, while others hindered the actions of local collectors and were similarly jailed by royal decree without trial. Because this method of imprisonment was normally only used when the state was in exceptional danger, Charles's use of it was viewed as abuse. When Parliament was summoned again in 1628, a representative named Sir Edward Coke authored the Petition of Right, a document which set out a list of specific liberties which Charles would be absolutely forbidden from infringing. Amongst other things, primary concerns were the illegality of arbitrary imprisonment and tax collection without parliamentary consent. In desperate need of parliamentary approval for funding, the king eventually accepted this document, but it is widely believed that he simply believed he was just reaffirming age-old liberties and was not conceding anything new. One of the main proponents of the petition was a staunch opponent of the king called John Pym, who would later become a parliamentary leader. Tensions escalated further when in 1629 a dispute about continuing royal customs collection was viewed by Parliament as an illegal contradiction of the Petition of Right. When the exasperated king ordered Parliament to adjourn, members held the Speaker, John Finch, in his chair so that the session could not formally end. He was held there long enough for resolutions against Charles's religious reforms and his collection of royal duties to be read out, a slight which was too much for the king. So on March 10, 1629, Charles I dissolved Parliament and arrested some of the ringleaders who had been behind the unrest, inadvertently making them martyrs and providing a rallying cry for those who opposed the absolute rule. With the would-be cash cow Parliament disbanded, the king made peace with his foreign enemies and embarked on a period of sole rule. To his supporters it was the personal rule, but to his enemies it was the more sinister-sounding 11 years tyranny. There is a general assumption that this decade-long period must have been very evil by its nature. While many occurrences within these twilight years of peace directly led to the strife of the 1640s and 50s, it was not nearly as horrific as it's often portrayed. In England, personal rule began quite positively. While hardcore Puritans, radical Protestants who were convinced that the Reformation was only half done, thought that so-called high church Arminianism was the devil's work, the common man was not as opposed. Many ordinary people responded quite positively to the more formal approach to religion and readily embraced William Laud's moderate reforms at the beginning of the 1630s. Even Henrietta Maria became more docile, and it's clear that the personal rule was a happy time for the royal family in a personal sense. The Queen even gave birth to a child named Charles in May of 1630, a child who 3 decades later would be King of England in his own right. Younger Charles's birth was supposedly celebrated with great enthusiasm across all 3 kingdoms that the Stuart dynasty held sovereignty over, with bonfires lit in the baby's honour. It must have been a happy time which the royals were soon to look back on with sorrow. Later, as a widow in her native France, Maria described her feelings during the 1630s golden years, stating that, "I was the happiest and most fortunate of queens, for not only had I every pleasure the heart could desire, I had a husband who adored me." In continental Europe, the situation calmed somewhat during the personal rule, with the death of Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen in 1632. Despite the Swedish king's reputation as a hero of Protestantism, the stalemate which ensued in the aftermath of his passing began to decrease the level of religious fear and paranoia felt in English society. Catholic dominance of the 30 Years' War during the 1620s had conjured a spectre of yet another invasion of the British Isles. With the stalemate, the threat deteriorated significantly, if it was ever possible at all. Meanwhile, Charles proved himself a champion of theatre, painting, architecture, music, and other aspects of high culture. Overall, a Capuchin priest named Father Cyprien reported back to his superiors in France that England is an abundant country and has no taxes. The inhabitants lead a luxurious life, far removed from the poverty of other places. As we will see, however, all was not well in England. Despite the Queen's increasing contentment, her zealous Catholicism was set to be an insurmountable problem for Charles. However much he tried, suspicious Protestant doubters would forever believe that Maria was attempting to use her position to slide England back into the grip of Rome. The Queen's many Catholic attendants who had accompanied her to England also proved themselves an issue, though not in Charles's own opinion. The king actually seemed to find the Catholic courtiers quite charming and found himself able to relax in their company. It is crucial to note in Charles's defense that he does not seem to have been going Catholic in any way, but had polarized interests which made it seem like he was. Specifically, he was tolerant of Catholics and an enemy to the extreme Puritans whom he and his new Archbishop of Canterbury saw as a threat. Upon ascending to that position in 1633, Laud began to overreach his authority and make everything worse for almost everyone who didn't share his own view on church matters. In addition to his Pope-light innovations to the Church of England, which convinced many Puritans that they were gradually being delivered to the Catholic Church on a silver platter, Laud also repeatedly prosecuted Puritans and opponents of episcopacy, the government of a church by bishops. One trial in 1637 became notorious for its brutality, involving 3 men named John Bastwick, William Prynne, and Henry Burton. They were pilloried for their defiance against Laud and had their ears cut off. Prynne had already suffered this punishment in 1634, and so his face was branded to bear the letters SL, or seditious libeller. This awful torture did...
Oh, here we go.
This awful torture didn't have the effect Laud wanted.
Oh, here we go. And it starts to buffer.
And even moderate Protestants viewed the trio as martyrs. To them, it was becoming clear what was happening. Vile Catholics were being allowed to practice out in the open, while good, pious Protestants were persecuted. William Laud would soon after cause the spark which eventually set England ablaze. As the Venetian ambassador said of him, "This pest may be the one which will ultimately disturb the kingdom." Despite the largely peaceful and tranquil nature of Charles's early personal rule, the need for money was not diminished in the slightest. Unwilling to call another parliament to grant him subsidies, a number of creative measures were used to raise royal funds and at the same time bypass Westminster. Predictably, these clever legal tricks were viewed by Parliament as blatant petty cash grabs. The first of these measures was the selling of monopolies over a product or industry to one individual or company, exploiting a loophole in the law that forbade this. Despite raising over £30,000 per year for the king, this policy angered almost everyone else. Merchants excluded by the monopoly were annoyed because they couldn't trade, and regular labourers were annoyed because under monopolies, prices tended to rise in return for inferior products. Most infamous was the soap monopoly. Dubbed Popish soap, this product supposedly blistered the hands of those using it, and because of the Catholic Manufacturing Board of the monopolist company, was said to blister the soul of Protestants as well. Charles also began reintroducing obsolete medieval laws in strange ways, reviving ancient fines on knights, people living in royal forests, and people building homes outside of designated areas in London. These fines were originally designed to coerce the fined individual into stopping a certain action, moving out of the forest, for example. But Charles did not want the individual to cease the action because he wanted to keep fining them and bringing in the money. While this was a technically legal and clever use of the letter of the law, it went against the spirit of the law and was widely viewed as unjust. The king's most infamous fundraising measure was called ship money, which was reintroduced in its original form in 1634. It essentially served as an emergency financial levy in case of invasion, which allowed the king to collect money if there was no time to call parliament. Maritime counties would contribute funds for the construction of ships, which would then theoretically be used in defense of those counties. It was a fair system if employed as it was intended, but of course Charles I found a way to make it despised. Supported by the meddlesome Archbishop Laud, Charles extended the collection of ship money to inland areas as well, areas which were traditionally exempt due to their lack of a coast. Moreover, the collection of ship money was an emergency levying of funds, and there was no true emergency. However, the king got around this by having his lawyers bring up an old statute dictating that it was the king who determined what was or was not an emergency. So, the king got his money at first. When the ship money tithe was repeated year after year, though, it became a massive problem to Parliament. After all, annual monetary tithes are in reality taxes, and taxes could only legally be raised with parliamentary consent, however much the king tried to legally state that it was not a tax. Naturally, all of this generated intense resistance from such individuals as John Hampden, whose actions in 1637 challenging ship money gave him a reputation as a champion of individual liberty. It also connected the parliamentary cause with property rights. In this episode, we've outlined the beginning of Charles I's reign all the way to the late 1630s and the last days of his increasingly controversial personal rule. In our next video, the twin fuses of religion and taxation will come together and cause an outbreak of violence in 1642 and the first decisive battle at Edgehill. The Cavaliers and Roundheads will soon come to blows, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel.
And that'll do it. But at the end, it's a good example why religion and politics should never mix. But that's just my opinion. But anyway, the Battle of Edgehill is the next episode. So anyway, if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.